The Death of News and the Weight of Truth. On the Collapse of Common Sense, the Noise of Power, and the Civic Duty of Discernment, by Elias Winter, September 1st, 2025. Read by an automated voice. Chapter 1. The Invention of News. News, in its modern sense, is a recent invention. For most of human history, information traveled by rumor, proclamation, sermon, or song. It came through the mouths of neighbors or the decrees of kings. The notion that there should exist a regularized account of reality, a daily or weekly ledger of what has happened in the world, was not obvious. It had to be built. The first newsletters of the 16th century were handwritten and sold to merchants who needed them for trade. They were never neutral. Their value was not accuracy, but utility, not truth, but advantage. In Venice or Augsburg, a report of a battle, a death, or a treaty mattered only in how it shifted the price of silk or grain. The news was never a covenant with the public. It was a private intelligence service sold to the highest bidder. When the printing press multiplied these sheets into gazettes, the Crown and the Church quickly learned that information was power. The so-called freedom of the press was born not from a moral devotion to truth, but from a political struggle over who controlled the voice of the realm. In England, the Stationers' Company served as both guild and censor, stamping authority on what could circulate. In France, the king's permission determined whether a report was legitimate or treasonous. The truth of early news was guaranteed only insofar as it aligned with power. Even in the democratic experiments of the 18th and 19th centuries, the press was less oracle of objectivity than organ of faction. In the United States, newspapers were party weapons, funded by subscriptions and patronage. One read the Gazette of the United States, or the National Intelligencer, not to know reality, but to know one's side. The reader was never a citizen neutrally informed, but a partisan rallying behind a banner. What changed in the industrial age was not the purity of news, but its scale. The penny press created a mass audience. Advertising created dependence on circulation. Scandal created sales. When Hearst and Pulitzer perfected yellow journalism, selling spectacle and invention as fact, it was not a corruption of a once pure system, but the flowering of its true nature. News as commodity, news as theater. And yet, out of this chaos arose a paradox. Precisely because sensationalism and scandal so often discredited the press, there emerged a movement toward professionalism. Editors discovered that credibility was itself a commodity. Codes of ethics were drafted. Journalism schools were founded. Objectivity, always an impossible dream, was elevated as an ideal, not because truth had suddenly become sacred, but because the market demanded stability. The reader needed to believe, if only provisionally, that the paper told the truth. Thus, the invention of news was never about truth as such. It was about control. Who would narrate the world? Who would define what counted as real? News was the mechanism by which information was extracted from life, processed into narrative, and sold back to the public under the guise of authority. Its accountability was never guaranteed. At every stage, manuscript, gazette, party press, penny paper, mass broadsheet, it was secured by power, patronage, money, or reputation. We look back now at the mid-20th century, the age of Cronkite, the voice of God anchor, as if it were a golden age of reliability. But this was no guarantee of truth, only the high watermark of monopoly. Television networks had consolidated authority. Dissenting voices were pushed to the margins. The appearance of uniform truth was the sound of concentrated power speaking in unison. It felt stable, but it was fragile, contingent, and temporary. The lesson of history is brutal. News was never born to serve truth. It was born to serve power, money, and order. Truth occasionally surfaced when reputations depended on it, when audiences demanded it, or when conscience broke through. But it was never the guarantee, only the accident. Chapter 2. False Guarantees. We comfort ourselves with the idea that the news once worked, that there was a time when facts were facts, when editors enforced standards, when the public could trust the morning paper or the evening broadcast. But this comfort is nostalgia, not history. The guarantees of news were never guarantees of truth. They were guarantees of order. The press in its so-called golden age seemed uniform because power was uniform. Printing was expensive, distribution required capital, broadcasting demanded towers and licenses. These were barriers to entry, and only a handful of institutions could afford them. The result was an illusion of stability. The truth looked singular, because only a few voices were allowed to speak at scale. In the United States, this took the form of the big three television networks, the major metropolitan dailies, and the wire services. Abroad, it was the BBC, Le Monde, Der Spiegel. Their consensus was not the flowering of truth, but the convergence of capital, government, and reputation. The New York Times was trusted not because it was incorruptible, but because it was the Times, backed by resources, prestige, and social authority. Its objectivity was an ethos designed to protect its status, not an unshakable covenant with truth. The mechanisms that passed for accountability were fragile. Reputation. A paper might lose credibility if caught lying, but only if rivals and readers punished it. Competition. Rival outlets could call out falsehoods, but often chose silence to preserve their own authority. Professional codes. Ethics were aspirational, not binding law. They depended on the character of editors and the vigilance of readers. Libel laws. Powerful individuals could defend themselves in court, but entire communities could be maligned without recourse. What looked like guarantees were, in truth, a web of pressures: economic, reputational, legal. None were absolute, and all were vulnerable to capture. The same system that occasionally exposed corruption also buried atrocities, delayed truths, and gave deference to power. This is why the uniformity of news cannot be romanticized. It silenced as much as it revealed. The civil rights movement was not propelled by the mainstream press, but forced into it by protest and spectacle. The Vietnam War was not questioned until resistance made denial impossible. For every Watergate, there were 100 cover-ups of corporate abuse, foreign intervention, domestic injustice. The so-called guarantees were selective. They guaranteed the smooth operation of liberal democracy, the preservation of markets, the appearance of consensus. They guaranteed stability for the middle class, reassurance for the elite, and continuity for the system. But truth that disrupted, truth that condemned cruelty, truth that named power, was never the baseline. It had to fight its way in. We remember the anchors of the broadcast age: Cronkite declaring Vietnam unwinnable, Murrow standing against McCarthy, as if they represent what news was. In fact, they represent rare moments when conscience broke through the machinery. They stand out precisely because they were exceptions. If the system truly guaranteed truth, we would not need to canonize those exceptions. The guarantees of news were thus false. They guaranteed voice, not veracity. They guaranteed that someone would tell the story, not that the story would be true. And when those guarantees collapsed under the weight of new technologies, cable, internet, social media, the illusion shattered. We did not lose truth. We lost the monopoly that once disguised the absence of it. Chapter 3. The Age of Noise. When the monopoly cracked, we mistook freedom for truth. The Internet promised liberation. No more gatekeepers, no more editors, no more anchors speaking in a single voice. Anyone could publish, anyone could broadcast, anyone could pierce the silence of power. It was supposed to be a renaissance of truth. Instead, it became an avalanche of noise. Decentralization dissolved the illusion of consensus. The barriers to entry fell away. No press to buy, no tower to lease, no printing plant to maintain. A webcam, a channel, a feed, that was enough. The whistleblower could speak, but so could the fabulist. The dissident could publish, but so could the demagogue. The same channels that amplified hidden truths became breeding grounds for endless lies. The architecture of the digital world was not built to sustain truth. It was built to sustain engagement. Algorithms rewarded whatever kept eyes on screens, fingers on keyboards, minds hooked to the feed. Outrage traveled faster than clarity. Fear traveled faster than nuance. Conspiracy was stickier than fact. The marketplace of attention became a race to the bottom, and the bottom had no floor. This was not an accident. It was a business model. Platforms discovered that division, outrage, and suspicion kept users returning. The more fractured the public, the more dependent it became on the drip feed of content. Truth was not suppressed. It was drowned. In an ocean of contradictory claims, every fact looked like just another opinion. Every cruelty like just another perspective. And so the age of noise dawned. Plural voices meant no common reference point. Infinite feeds meant no stable horizon of reality. Algorithmic curation meant the map of the world was privately drawn for each individual. The very conditions that once made news appear uniform, scarcity of outlets, high costs of entry, were inverted. Now there was abundance, and abundance was indistinguishable from chaos. The fascist saw his chance. In a world where truth and lies travel at the same speed, he does not need to persuade, only to confuse. He does not need to silence dissent, only to flood it with noise. Authoritarianism thrives not in silence, but in cacophony, when the listener, exhausted by contradictions, throws up his hands and believes nothing. The Internet did not kill truth outright. It smothered it. It made truth harder to distinguish from fraud, conscience harder to hear above spectacle. It turned news from a flawed but bounded enterprise into a hall of mirrors where every reflection looks equally real, equally unreal. We had thought that decentralization would free us from the voice of power, but it did not give us truth. It gave us cacophony, in which truth is a whisper, faint and fleeting, easily lost in the roar. This is the age of noise, not the end of speech, but the end of common sense. Chapter 4. The Collapse of Accountability. In the old order, fragile as it was, there were at least points of contact where lies could be challenged. An editor could spike a story. A rival paper could expose a fabrication. A libel court could punish reputational slander. A network, bound by license, could be compelled to grant equal time. None of these were perfect, none were guarantees, but they imposed friction. Falsehood had to navigate obstacles. On YouTube, on TikTok, on the algorithmic feed, those obstacles vanish. The liar is not filtered by an editor or disciplined by a newsroom. He is rewarded by the algorithm. His fabrication is not suppressed, but monetized. Views are currency, outrage is capital. And the platform's incentive is not to slow him, but to speed him up. The old accountability structures do not scale to this new terrain. Editors, there are none. The editorial gate is gone. The gates are now recommendation engines, tuned not to truth, but to engagement. Professional norms. YouTubers are not journalists bound by codes. They are entrepreneurs, performers, demagogues. Their allegiance is to audience capture, not to the fragile discipline of verification. Reputation. In a fragmented ecosystem, reputations do not cross borders. A charlatan discredited in one circle can flourish in another, sustained by the loyalty of his tribe. Libel law. Courts move in years. Videos spread in seconds. By the time the legal machinery begins, the damage has gone viral, archived, mirrored, monetized. The liar has discovered his immunity. He knows that being debunked is not a risk, but a strategy. The rebuttal drives more traffic to his name. The correction amplifies the original claim. In the age of noise, exposure does not diminish lies, it circulates them. And the platforms, those new publishers who pretend they are not publishers, wash their hands of responsibility. They claim neutrality while engineering addiction. They claim passivity while curating every feed. They enforce rules inconsistently, swayed by politics, profit, and public pressure. They wield godlike power without accepting the burden of editors or the scrutiny of courts. What this means is stark. The very mechanisms that once kept lies at least partially in check have been bypassed. The liar no longer needs to persuade the editor, endure the lawsuit, maintain broad reputation. He only needs to capture a fragment of the audience and exploit the architecture of the feed. Accountability dissolves into metrics. We are living in the aftermath of that collapse. Falsehood is no longer punished. It is incentivized. Cruelty is no longer restrained. It is recommended. News no longer passes through human judgment before it reaches us. It passes through machines calibrated for profit. The crisis is not that people lie. People have always lied. The crisis is that our systems no longer possess the tools to slow them, check them, or expose them. Lies now move at the speed of light, while accountability crawls at the pace of law, reputation, and memory. And in that gap, entire worlds are constructed, entire movements armed, entire realities undone. Chapter 5. The Dead Internet. There is a point where noise ceases to be merely irritating and becomes annihilating. When the signal is so buried that listening itself feels pointless. When the flood of content is so artificial that human presence evaporates. The Internet begins to feel not alive but dead. This is the intuition behind what some call the dead Internet theory. That more and more of what we encounter online is not written by people, not grounded in experience, not tied to witness, but manufactured by machines. Spam sites, AI-written articles, auto-generated comments, synthetic videos, all crowding the feed with speech that is not speech, words that are not testimony. Add to this the omnipresence of surveillance. When every keystroke is tracked, when devices are bugged, when the walls themselves listen, authenticity withdraws. People censor themselves, perform themselves, retreat from themselves. The result is an Internet populated not by souls but by shadows. The more it is watched, the less it lives. What emerges is not silence, but ghostliness. An endless churn of content without authorship, opinions without owners, outrage without origin. Bots amplify talking points. AI mimics the tone of trusted writers. Videos surface whose source cannot be traced. You scroll and cannot shake the suspicion that nothing you are reading is real, that you are swimming in a sea of mimicry. This is what it means for the Internet to die. Not that the servers go dark or the cables are cut, but that the medium ceases to carry trustworthy presence. It becomes a necropolis of speech, a cemetery of voices, where what speaks cannot be distinguished from what fabricates. When that death comes, the response will not be reform, but retreat. People will look elsewhere for truth. Some will return to print, to books, to the slowness of paper. Others will turn to local gatherings, to circles of trust, to whispered words. Some will build private enclaves online, encrypted groups, hidden forums, curated newsletters, but these will feel less like the public square and more like the underground. History has seen this before. In the Soviet Union, where official newspapers were propaganda, citizens turned to samizdat, hand-copied, clandestine texts passed from hand to hand. In Nazi Germany, rumor networks often carried more truth than the radio. When the dominant medium collapses, humans build new channels of survival. The tragedy is that the Internet once promised to be the opposite. A great commons, a universal library, a place where humanity might speak to itself without gatekeepers. Instead, it risks becoming the very opposite of what it was born to be: a machine of mimicry and noise, a theater of ghosts. When the Internet dies, it will not be buried. It will continue to speak, louder than ever. But it will speak without witness, without accountability, without soul. And those who seek truth will have to leave its wide boulevards for smaller, narrower, slower paths, the places where presence still survives. Chapter 6. The Listener's Burden. When institutions collapse, when platforms refuse responsibility, when the Internet itself begins to feel spectral, the responsibility falls back on the listener, the citizen, the ordinary soul staring into the glow of a screen, trying to make sense of the flood. This is not a responsibility most people asked for. It is heavy, exhausting, unfair, but it is real. In the absence of gatekeepers, you must become the gatekeeper. In the absence of common standards, you must construct your own. In the absence of trust, you must learn to doubt, discern, and decide. What does this burden look like? A grain of salt as default. Every headline, every video, every post. Assume it carries an angle, a motive, a hidden hand. Suspicion is no longer cynicism, but civic duty. Trace the money. Who funds this channel? Who benefits, if you believe it? If the source is anonymous, be wary. If it is wealthy, assume it does not have the working class in mind. Truth does not usually wear the mask of plutocracy. Watch for cruelty. Lies often reveal themselves not in data, but in spirit. When speech delights in cruelty, when it divides and degrades, it is not truth, but manipulation. Attend to exhaustion. The greatest danger is not that you will be deceived, but that you will grow too tired to care. Noise is designed to drain you, to make discernment feel impossible. To resist is not only to fact-check, but to guard your energy, to refuse despair. This burden is civic in the deepest sense. The health of a republic is not measured by the smoothness of its institutions, but by the vigilance of its people. To be a listener now is to be more than a consumer. It is to be a guardian of attention, a custodian of conscience. And yet the danger is clear. Individuals are fragile. Most do not have the time, the training, or the stamina to carry this weight alone. The liar knows this. The algorithm exploits this. The system counts on fatigue. That is why the listener's burden must be shared. Truth cannot survive as a purely private responsibility. Families, communities, unions, circles of trust, these must become filters, validators, guardians together. When people sift meaning in common, discernment has a chance. When people are isolated, fatigue wins. We are, each of us, the last line of defense against lies, but no one can hold that line alone. The listener's burden is heavy. and it will break us unless we carry it not as individuals stranded in noise, but as communities refusing cruelty together. Chapter 7. The Lost Moral Framework. Beneath all the noise, all the algorithms, all the lies, there is a deeper absence. We no longer share a moral horizon. Once, however imperfectly, religion named certain acts as sins, cruelty as violation, truth as sacred. Later, secular civic ideals, reason, democracy, human rights, took on that role, offering at least a fragile compass. Today, that compass is shattered. We live in a society where there is no longer a common language of evil. Cruelty is not universally condemned. It is content. Lies are not universally shamed. They are strategy. What was once moral transgression has become entertainment, rhetoric, just another perspective. This absence is what makes us defenseless. Facts alone cannot protect against cruelty when cruelty is no longer framed as intolerable. Statistics cannot defend dignity when dignity itself is no longer sacred. A society that cannot agree that cruelty is evil is a society in which cruelty will flourish. History shows us the cost. In Weimar Germany, democratic freedoms dissolved into cynicism, and no moral framework held back the tide of scapegoating. In post-Soviet Russia, the collapse of communist ideology left a vacuum quickly filled by nationalism and mafia power. In both cases, the absence of a common moral ground left ordinary people naked before propaganda and violence. We are living in a similar vacuum. Religion has retreated into private enclaves, stripped of civic force. Secular ideals are contested, hollowed, mocked. Freedom, democracy, human rights. These words no longer command reverence. They are slogans in partisan wars. What remains is the market, the algorithm, the spectacle, a machine that measures engagement, not conscience. This is why the age of noise feels so suffocating. It is not only that there are too many voices. It is that there is no shared measure of what is right. No sacred line that cannot be crossed. No word, truth, justice, dignity that holds authority beyond one's tribe. In this vacuum, authoritarian movements flourish. They promise a false moral order, purity, race, nation, blood. They restore meaning by scapegoating, by inventing sacredness out of exclusion. And because the liberal order can answer only with procedures and data, the counterfeit often feels stronger, more alive, more binding. The tragedy is not only that we have lost a moral framework, but that we do not yet know how to build a new one. We sense the hunger for it, in protests, in movements, in the yearning for belonging, but the common sacred has not yet returned. Until it does, we are exposed. Epilogue: A Code of Witness. We cannot resurrect the guarantees of the past. The age of monopoly is gone, the age of noise has arrived, and the sacred horizon is not yet restored. But even in this wasteland, it is possible to live truthfully, not by conquering the system, not by silencing the noise, but by inhabiting a discipline, a code of witness. 1. Guard your conscience. Every day, you will be invited to lie to yourself, to accept cruelty as entertainment, to treat outrage as truth, to surrender attention to noise. Resist. Even small refusals matter. Truth is not an abstraction. It is the refusal to bend your conscience for convenience. 2. Carry a grain of salt. Treat every claim as provisional. Ask, who benefits if I believe this? Who funds this? Who delights in my outrage? Do not become paralyzed by suspicion, but let it sharpen you. Doubt is not cynicism. It is the beginning of clarity. 3. Trace the money. Expose the mask. When speech comes from wealth, assume manipulation. When it comes from anonymity, ask why it hides. Transparency is not everything, but hidden funding and secret channels are signals of distortion. Follow the trail of power, and you will find the machinery behind the words. 4. Refuse cruelty. This is the simplest and most sacred test. Truth does not delight in degradation. Lies often cloak themselves in the pleasure of contempt. If a voice asks you to enjoy cruelty, it is not truth. To refuse cruelty is to keep the sacred alive, even when the world has forgotten it. 5. Protect your energy. Noise seeks not only to deceive but to exhaust, to scroll endlessly, to argue fruitlessly, to drown in the flood. This is how lies win. Practice slowness, read books, step outside, speak face to face. Silence is not withdrawal, it is resistance. 6. Share the burden in community. Do not try to hold the line alone. Find others who refuse lies, who resist cruelty, who guard memory. Truth is fragile in isolation, resilient in fellowship. Build circles where discernment is practiced together. 7. Remember the future. Truth is not only about today. What we archive, what we pass on, what we preserve against noise, this is tomorrow's history. Guard testimony. Keep records. Preserve witness. Lies dissolve when memory outlives them. This code is not a solution. It is not a system. It is a discipline, a way of surviving in an age where the guarantees of truth have collapsed. It will not make the noise vanish. It will not resurrect the golden age, but it will keep a flame alive, the flame of conscience, the flame of dignity, the flame that refuses cruelty. To live by this code is to become a witness, not to control the world, but to refuse to let the world's lies control you, not to silence the noise, but to outlast it. In the ruins of news, in the death of the internet, in the vacuum of the sacred, the witness remains. And sometimes, the witness is enough to keep truth alive. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.